what should the US government and what can US citizens do to help these individuals, with translators, for example?
Well, at this point, putting pressure for U.S. citizens to put pressure on the U.S. Congress, to put pressure on the administration to allow translators and their families to come to the United States is about the only thing that we can do. And then the fact that the U.S. is sending in 3,000 more military to secure the Kabul International Airport so that the translators, as well as the embassy communities and the international NGOs, will have a way to get out of Afghanistan is, it's happening now. Now, the translators for units that were out in the countryside they're in a real predicament because the roads leading into Kabul to the airport are now taken by the Taliban. And it depends on whether they can convince the Taliban that they should be allowed to go to Kabul. Of course, they wouldn't tell them why, but just that they have relatives in Kabul and need to go there. And then hopefully they can get on one of the flights that's leaving to get them out of harm's way. But there will be a lot of retaliation, unfortunately, but it's happened in every circumstance where the US military has gone in. And you mentioned that I was a part of the evacuation of the US Embassy in Sierra Leone in 1996. And that was one of the, even though the coup against the elected government, the coup that was done by rebel forces, the Revolutionary United Front, and part of the military of Sierra Leone, the coup was not directed, it was directed at the elected government and not in retaliation for anything the US did. So our employees, local employees at the embassy, were not in direct retaliation for the military or the rebel forces. However, some of our employees said, we will not feel comfortable with that group that's coming in because the Revolutionary United Front was a very brutal group that murdered people out in the countryside at will. And just the gratuitous violence that you could be in the wrong place in the wrong time and a bunch of guys that are high on drugs come by and either shoot you or cut your arm off or cut your ear off. That was very possible. So some of our employees wanted to leave when we evacuated the US employees, and we let them do that. We took them with us on the US military ship that came to evacuate us.
If the US Embassy, the UK Embassy and others are evacuated, what will the consequences for democratic societies be? Will Taliban success inspire attacks in other regions?
Well, that's a good question. The US closed its embassy in Afghanistan after it was open during the time the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. Our embassy remained open. It was only closed when the civil war between the Mujahideen forces, the warlord forces, who had actually had success in getting the Soviets out, and then they started fighting among themselves and sending rockets in different parts of Kabul, and it became a very dangerous place, not from the Soviets, but from the fighting on the warlords. So the decision was the US would close its embassy. But not all embassies closed in Kabul during the time the Taliban was there. The German embassy stayed open. And there were some embassies that were open. The UK and the US closed their embassies. I would anticipate that, the Taliban I think they want the U.S. Embassy to stay open, and they will not violate the premises of it, I don't think, because they want international aid. And the U.S. has offered to continue international aid as long as whatever group is in power is not killing Afghans. Well, that's going on right now. But I think there are negotiations still going on with the Taliban in Doha. The US, the Russians, the Canadians, the Chinese have all been meeting with the Taliban in Doha in the last couple of days. And I think the Taliban, it knows that if they get aid from any place, they better watch their step in terms of not destroying embassies or governmental properties. And they're the ones that are going to be the government. So that whatever they destroy, they're going to have to rebuild in some way. And when the Taliban was in power from 1996 to 2001, they ran the government. They were in the ministries at the national level, the regional level, the state level. They were in charge of getting electricity, water, sewage. All of this were obligations that they took on. And by some accounts, they did a pretty good job of it. But they were very brutal on particularly religious terms and the treatment of women. They were very, very brutal. But they did continue the governmental obligations while they were in power. And I anticipate that they will do the same thing. They are doing that in the regions that they control. They get taxes from people. But they do provide, allow the services to continue that have been built into the system.
So right now, these governments are negotiating with a terrorist organization in Doha.
Yeah, they are. The U.S. Special Envoy for Negotiations has been negotiating with them for 2 years. That's Zalmay Khalilzad, who has been in 2001 and 2. He was the U.S. Special Envoy to Afghanistan under the Bush administration. Then he became the U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan. Then he became the U.S. Ambassador to Iraq. Then he became the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. And he was brought back in by the Trump administration specifically for negotiations with the Taliban. And that's where this agreement between the Taliban and the United States took place. And that took place under the Trump administration. There is a signed agreement by the United States under the Trump administration with the Taliban. And the Biden administration is implementing that agreement with the Taliban. Zalmay Khalilzad has been kept on as the special negotiator with the Taliban by the Biden administration. And he, of all people, I mean, he's Afghan. He lived in Afghanistan until he was a teenager, and then his family moved to the US. He almost became a candidate for president of the country. But instead, he decided he would become the US ambassador to Afghanistan. So he, of all people, has the cultural background, the political knowledge of what the Taliban is all about. And he negotiated an agreement which excluded the government of Afghanistan, which was terrible, because then it left the government of Afghanistan to have to negotiate afterwards, and in a position of weakness, rather than having the U.S. and the government negotiating together. But the Taliban did not want to do that, and the Taliban got its way.
Does it amount to United States abandoning its ally, and will Taliban conduct itself like ISIS as an expensive force launching into neighboring countries directing terrorist attacks abroad?
Well, that's certainly one of the questions that we have. The agreement that the Taliban signed with the US specifically precludes that. The Taliban has said, no, we won't do that. And there have been Taliban delegations that have gone to China, and specifically because the Chinese want an agreement from the Taliban that they will not let Uyghur extremists train in Afghanistan. The same with Pakistan, although the Pakistanis totally support the Taliban, but they don't want the Taliban to let any other groups in there to train. The Iranians have always had a difficult relationship with the Taliban because the Taliban murdered 5 of its diplomats in Mazar-Sharif back in 1998. But the border, certainly the Iranians are not about to let the Taliban train groups that would be destructive toward Iran. The ISIS group reportedly already has some people in there. There are international fighters such that, we used to call Al-Qaeda was one of the groups of foreign fighters. Now ISIS, another group. There are so many named groups now that are proliferating that the probability that there are these groups in there is very high. And then it'll be up to the Taliban to keep control on them. And if they don't keep control on them, I think the US will come back in with airstrikes to blow up the training bases as they find them. I doubt if the US will ever try to invade and occupy Afghanistan again. After 20 years and $1 trillion, I think that the US political class says enough. But if there are terrorist acts that are coming from Afghanistan, I have no doubts the US will use drones and B-52s and bomb specific training sites. And probably other countries will too. NATO countries would do that. The Iranians might do that too if they start seeing that groups are being trained in Afghanistan and then slip back into Iran.
What is next for you and for Veterans for Peace?
Well, we, Veterans for Peace and CODEPINK Women for Peace and all of these peace groups in the US, we've been calling for the US to get out of Afghanistan. For the longer that the US stays there, the more Afghans are killed by military operations. And one of the outgrowths of the US leaving is another surge in the tragic deaths of more Afghan civilians. We will continue to challenge the US on its warmongering policies. The US Congress has now enacted the largest military budget ever in the history of the United States. Most of the US focus until just this week with the surge of the Taliban, most of the focus has been on the Pacific and China and some on Russia, but it's mostly now pivoting toward China and calling China an enemy and a military threat. It certainly has been an economic, I wouldn't call it a threat, but a competitor, a very vibrant competitor. But the US is now using military terms to challenge China's economic progress and saying that China's military is too aggressive and is destabilizing the region and sending large numbers of naval vessels into the South China Sea and sending large numbers of aircraft to Guam and Australia as a show of force. And any of these military war maneuvers could accidentally or maybe intentionally start a military confrontation that would be very problematic in terms of, I mean, the Chinese, their budget, military budget, is only 1/3 of what the U.S. is, and their military equipment is much less than what the U.S. has. But anytime there is a conflict, there is going to be a large amount of munitions that are fired at each other, and a large number of people that'll be killed. So that's what we're really focusing on, as well as the tragedy of Afghanistan, but also on the U.S. aggressive behavior in the South China Sea.
Thank you very much for this interview, Colonel Wright.
Well, you're most welcome. It's been a pleasure. You always have very, very good questions. You've done your homework.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.